You don't need loads of really expensive kit to get into macro photography. I took all of these photos on a 10-year-old discontinued camera with a second-hand lens and a few accessories, and I'll be showing you what kit you need to do the same. Full transparency, my macro photography setup is worth just over £730, and it's made up of kit that I already owned and some that I've bought. Also, this is just what's worked for me. I'm not an expert, this is still a hobby that I'm getting into, and I'm just here to share things based on my experience and my research, and I'd encourage you to do lots of research from different sources before buying any kit. Anyways, right there behind me is my current macro photography setup. Just very quickly, it's a Sony a6000 camera, a Metabones EF to E-mount T adapter to attach a Canon EF mount 50mm 1.4 lens, a Canon EF25 Mark II extension tube, a Canon EF12 Mark II extension tube, a newer TT560 flash, and a dirt cheap diffuser that I got from Amazon. Now, I have overcomplicated things slightly with my setup by mixing a Sony camera with Canon lenses. The reason I've done that is that I have a Canon camera with Canon EF mount lenses. I then got a Sony a6000, which is E-mount, and it came with a horrible Sony kit lens, disgusting. So instead of buying a brand new set of Sony lenses, I just bought a second-hand Metabones adapter so that I could put my Canon lenses on the Sony camera and save myself some money. I did all of this a few years ago before I even considered taking up macro photography. Obviously, you don't have to do this. I'd recommend just buying a camera that fits your lenses or vice versa. However, this mix and matching of different kits highlights something that I want to emphasize in this video. You can get a good macro setup by assembling kit you already have if you're already into your photography. Also, just thought I'd mention this is a fully manual macro photography setup. On higher end cameras, you have firmware where you can, click the shutter and it does the focus bracketing for you. And in some cameras, it even does the focus stacking within the camera using the firmware in the camera. My setup is purely for manually focusing on a subject, taking a photo, moving the camera forward a bit, taking a photo, moving the camera forward, taking a photo, etc., until you have your stack, and then later on editing it together in Lightroom or Photoshop to get your final image. But this isn't a how to do macro photography video. I can do that at another point if people want. This is just purely about kit. So let's get on with it and talk about prices. First, the camera body. I have a Sony a6000 camera, like I said earlier, and although this camera was first released in 2014, it still stands up today and is a great option for entry-level photographers. It's got an APS-C size sensor, which I think is ideal for macro photography. This sensor is smaller than full-frame sensors, meaning your images are cropped in comparison to full-frame, which is actually very useful in macro photography, where you want to be cropped in on your subject as much as you can. One important thing I've learned about macro photography is don't fret about having a full-frame camera. There's definitely huge benefits to small sensors. Some of the most popular cameras used for macro photography have micro four thirds sensors, which are nice and small. The sensor on this Sony a6000 is 24.3 megapixels, which on a sensor this size is absolutely plenty, and the images it creates are nice and sharp. The raw photos on this camera are great. I always shoot in RAW when doing macro photography. It's especially useful on lower budget setups like mine, where it's more difficult to get your exposure correct. I'm using a cheap flash, a cheap diffuser. I'm often shooting tiny subjects, often at nighttime, and I'm using extension tubes, which I'll get onto in a minute. So the lighting isn't always perfect. But having the option of raw files to edit, which hold in loads of information, is great. For example, I took this terribly underexposed photo of a spider. I'd set the ISO far too low, and by the time I'd corrected my camera settings, the spider had run away. So I missed my chance to shoot it in the correct exposure, but because I shot in RAW, I was able to lift the exposure in post-production in Lightroom, add some denoise, and it actually came out quite nicely. Quick tip if you're specifically using the Sony a6000 camera for macro photography. Make sure to go into your menu and on the second row of the settings tab, turn live view display to setting effect off. When lowering the exposure settings on the camera to compensate for the flash, you often can't see anything on the monitor anymore. So by turning this setting off, you can still see what you're taking pictures of on your camera monitor, as the monitor doesn't actually reflect your exposure settings when that is off. It just shows your composition. So the cost. This camera is available secondhand online. I believe it's been discontinued now, so you can't get it brand new. At least I couldn't find it anywhere brand new. But on websites like mbp.com, you can get them in excellent condition from £329 at the time of recording this video, which is great. This isn't an ad, by the way. I'm not affiliated with MBP, but I recommend getting kit like this secondhand from somewhere like that. I get kit from MBP often. It's well priced, and from MBP you get a 6-month warranty, which is very handy for secondhand kit. Honestly, any entry-level mirrorless camera with similar specs to this will do macro photography as long as it's got an interchangeable lens mount. So if, like me, you've already got some Canon lenses because you've got a Canon cinema camera, for example, and you don't want to switch brands, you could get a Canon 250D, a Canon M50, or something like that. These are in a similar price range to the A6000 and shoot RAW photos, and they'd be absolutely fine for macro photography. So, onto the part that actually turns regular photos into macro photos, extension tubes. If you're not familiar, extension tubes don't have any glass or anything fancy in them. They're literally just tubes and work by increasing the space between your camera sensor and the camera's lens, which decreases the minimum focusing distance, the distance between your lens and your subject. And this allows you to get nice and close to a subject and take your magnified macro photos. With extension tubes, the longer they are, the more you can magnify your subject. And the great thing about extension tubes is you can stack them on top of each other to increase their overall length. So for me, I have a 25mm extension tube and a 12mm extension tube, and I stack them on top of each other, and they work really nicely. More specifically, I have a Canon EF25 Mark II, which you can get from £58 secondhand, and a Canon EF12 Mark II, which you can get from £22 secondhand at the time I'm recording this. With extension tubes, if you can, I would definitely recommend getting them secondhand. It's a lot cheaper, and it's literally just a tube that can attach to a lens. It's nothing fancy. In my opinion, you shouldn't be paying loads for this. Obviously, you don't have to get Canon extension tubes. That's just what I have for my setup. You can get extension tubes which are suitable for all manufacturers. Not all manufacturers make them themselves like Canon do. From looking online, I don't think Sony actually produce extension tubes, but there are lots of third-party options for Sony E-mount lenses, plenty of companies that make extension tubes for Sony cameras. So if you have a Sony or any camera really, you can still do macro photography with extension tubes. It just takes a little bit of research. Adding some extension tubes to your kit isn't costly compared to buying a whole new lens, and I'd seriously recommend doing this if you're just trying out macro photography before committing to anything more expensive later on. One thing to note about extension tubes: the focal length of your lens cannot be less than the size of the tube or combined sizes of multiple tubes, or you won't be able to focus. So with my setup, the combined size of the tube is 37, it's 25 plus 12. So my 50mm lens works fine because 50 is longer than 37. But if, for example, I were to use a 35mm lens with both of the tubes, I would not be able to focus at all. So bear that in mind. Right, obviously you need a lens. I'll keep this short and sweet. Any lens can be a macro lens when used with extension tubes, prime lenses, zoom lenses, it doesn't matter. My preferred lens is a Canon 50mm 1.4. You can get them online secondhand from £114. The lens choice is down to personal preference. I'd say from personal experience, just me trying out different things, that any lens from 50mm to 100mm in focal length is fine for macro photography. You can go wider if you want to. I've done some nice macro work on a 35mm lens, for example, But you just have to bear in mind you're limited to shorter extension tube lengths when you get that wide. And I tend to find when you're shooting wider, you just come across more issues really. So longer lenses like 50 to 100mm are best for macro photography, in my opinion. When shooting subjects so close up, it's difficult to get a good amount of light onto your sensor. Adding extension tubes reduces light, and also when you're that close to a subject, the depth of field is tiny, so you increase your f-stop. I usually have mine to around f9, and these small apertures obviously reduce the amount of light you have. And this is where the flash comes in. Disclaimer, I know very little about flashes at this point in time. Making this setup was my first time using a flash. I bought this newer TT560 speedlight because it was the cheapest one that I could find by a brand that I recognized. It's been working fine for me. It cost me $54.99 and it runs on AA batteries. It has an intensity scale from 1 to 8, which is useful for shooting in different lighting environments. I found it can keep up with taking photos in quick succession, but not too quick though. It won't keep up in burst mode, for example. It just won't be able to recharge and flash again for each photo. But I'd say generally it's very good for its price. And then the diffusion you can do really cheaply. I got this cheap flash diffuser from Amazon for $8.99 from a brand called Sony. You can use white baking paper if you like. I also use that as well. Just tape it to the top of the flash. Sometimes I combine a diffuser with white baking paper and the images actually come out quite nicely. Having said that, I find on the cheaper end, it's actually quite difficult to diffuse the flash well. I'm still getting peaking highlights on my images with this setup, but on a budget, a cheap diffuser like this, it gets the job done and you can experiment until you get the lighting how you like it. And that's it. That's my whole kit. In total, including the Metabones EF to E-mount adapter, my kit cost £731.98. And there's loads of different setups from other manufacturers available. It's whatever works best for you. Like I said, you can take any elements from this setup that you might find useful and build your own. I think for a lot of people watching this video, you will literally just need an extension tube or two and you'll be good to go. Anyways, I hope being able to see my setup has been useful. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Check out my channel for other wildlife related video and photography content, and I'll see you next time.